Hi, this is Karen at the Meaning Code. We explore reality using every means possible. And today I'm going to be talking to Michael about the way everything seems to reduce to the binary.
Sure.
So I have this big idea.
Okay.
I've been reading The Master and His Emissary by
Mm-hmm.
Iain McGilchrist. I think you watched the video where he had a long discussion with Jordan Peterson.
Yep. That was a way back in the day. What was that, like 2018 or so?
Yeah, they're talking about the left hemisphere and right hemisphere,
Yep.
which is what his whole book is about. And as I was reading it, this picture started to form in my head that there is some aspect of being where every level of being relates to these two hemispheres. So it's
Yeah.
take
I've often thought of that. There's a digital component of that too.
yes, everything seems to come down to binary. I mean,
Yeah.
did you listen to the Penrose portal?
I started listening to it. I didn't get as far as I would have liked.
Okay, well, in the second half, they start talking about his twister theory and all the events that happened in his life that led him to begin to think about different aspects of that theory. And
Is the twister related to the spinners, or is that something
yes,
separate?
related to the spinners.
It is?
He sees only a two spin, where a lot of the more current thinking is that there is a four spin, and but he still believes in this two spin idea.
Okay.
Because he has this really big idea that the complex numbers are more real, more fundamental than the real numbers, and that the world is
That's
actually
Eric's, or that's Penrose's idea?
Penrose's idea, that
Interesting.
the world is actually more beautifully described by complex numbers than it is by real numbers.
That's interesting because, I know one of Eric's big things is he's in love with the idea of the square root. And the square root, the complex numbers are a function of an impossible square root, which is the square root of -1.
Right.
That's where everything deviates off the regular timeline, because you can't have a square root of nothing multiplied by itself can equal -1.
Right. So that's the imaginary number, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which may not be imaginary, right?
But what's funny is I think we may have talked about this way, way, way back when. I don't know if I put it forward to you or you put it forward to me, but like I used to think the imaginary numbers were like really not so interesting. Like they had relatively zero correlations with reality, other than it was just some fun math thing that somebody discovered. And then I don't know what it was that all of basically any sort of 2 or 3D or multiple dimension structures can be described with even less versions of the imaginary numbers. That to me was incredibly interesting.
Well, where he gets to talking about it in this discussion so I want to hear about the square root thing from Eric. What aspect of the square root thing is that he particularly onto?
What is he? I don't know. I know he knows his whole concept of the portal, which is the name of his show, is his he thinks of the square root as a portal. That square root function is somehow this portal to something else, and his thinking is that we fundamentally don't understand the nature of reality, and that we've got enough pieces in play that we should have this ability to kind of to get there. It's very strange.
For you to hear the second half of this.
Okay.
You're gonna love it. You're gonna love it. Because when he goes down this road of complex numbers, it turns out that when you're in the world of complex numbers, there are only half as many dimensions. So if you have a line of, if you have a plane of complex numbers, it's actually a line
Right.
in the complex world.
Right.
And if you have a sphere of complex numbers, it's actually a circle in the complex world.
Right. Right. So this must be related to what we, did you ever watch that, the video I sent you most recently about the YouTube video where they're explaining gravity at like 5 different levels?
Yes, I got through the first level and a half, and I didn't get any farther.
Okay, so once you get to the expert level, they start to move into this. They call it the holographic principle, whereas what we experience of reality as a 3-dimensional space actually seems like it. And this has something to do with black holes and what we've learned about black holes and the math that goes into it. That it's really can be described by just a surface, a flat surface. And that it seems like
the theory there, and this still doesn't make sense to me, is that all of the information that is contained within the sphere can be represented on the surface of the sphere. So that the whole, if you thought of them as cubic bits all contained inside the sphere, you could break that out and they could all be described on the surface of the sphere, which seems impossible. I mean, if you think of how much information, if you made information in little like 1 centimeter cubes or something and stuffed it inside a sphere, and you broke that out and put it on the outside of the sphere, it seems like there would be a lot more than just what will cover the outside of the sphere. But, you know, that's what they say, so I'm going to believe them. But getting back to Iain McGilchrist and the 2 hemispheres, let me just walk you through the way he describes the 2 hemispheres and the connections that that go on between them, because I think you'll see once I start describing it that this relates to almost every field of knowledge, but it certainly relates to quantum mechanics and this whole issue that we've been talking about with science lacking humility.
Right.
You know, where science gets down into its silo and gets all atomized and can't see outside of its silo and is not making connections anymore. So there's 2 hemispheres. The right hemisphere, the right hemisphere depends on that which is outside of it. There's something outside the brain that the right hemisphere is responding to. And the right hemisphere either says no to this outside thing, or it does not say no to it. And if it does not say no to it, then that permits.
What do you mean by, when you say no, how do you conceptualize that?
How do I conceptualize that? Well,
when you say no, like, no, I don't think
talking about when he uses, sometimes he uses the terminology inhibitory function.
Right.
That both the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere.
See, this gets back to my whole binary thing.
Functions. Yes.
It seems like there's a yes, no in every sort of processing. So, you know, the one you could think about this, if let's imagine that all, like, that the left and the right hemisphere, that all their activity bubbles up into a single yes or a no, that all this calculation equals a 0 or a 1, and then the same on the left hand side. So that what that ends up with, though, is it leaves you with 4 different states, right? So you could have both say no. You know, one says yes, one says no on this side, or you reverse it, yes and no, or they both say yes. So you get up these 4 different states.
Well, but this is how the processing works, so that's a little bit different than that. So just hold on a second. There's 2 differences. One is, it's not yes and no, it's no and not no, which I love. I have to tell you a little story about the no and not no.
And the no is the inhibition or the not inhibited.
Yes, if it's not no, then basically it's saying I will receive or I'll accept that.
Huh.
So the no is I reject it. The not no is I will permit it. I will permit it into me.
That's very interesting, because I think one of the things that seems to relate to me is the very feminine nature of humanity.
Yeah. We're gonna get there. Let me just finish explaining the two hemispheres.
Okay.
So the right hemisphere aspects of being must disclose their presence to the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere, okay, it either receives or does not receive these aspects of being.
Right.
The way I sort of see it is like, okay, you have this infinite field of potential in front of you. The right hemisphere's job is to see where the anomalies lie in that field of potential, or to see what's rising up in the salience field, and then to make choices. Am I going to acknowledge that particular thing in the salience field or not acknowledge it?
Yeah.
Only the things which are acknowledged by the right hemisphere, according to Iain McGilchrist, only those things which are acknowledged by the right hemisphere come into being.
Huh.
Now, once the right hemisphere chooses to acknowledge one of these things, it sends it over to the left hemisphere for processing. And the left hemisphere, the way he puts it is, the left hemisphere can only respond to what is presented to it by the right hemisphere. And then it can either say no, or it can permit it to be presented. It does not know what the right hemisphere knows, and it cannot, and therefore cannot be involved in its coming into being as such. So all coming into being happens through the right hemisphere. Then the right hemisphere sends it to the left hemisphere for processing. The left hemisphere either says no or not no.
Yeah.
And if the left hemisphere says not no, then it receives it, processes it, and then sends it back to the right hemisphere. So both hemispheres have this inhibitory function. Either one can say no, but the left hemisphere can only say no to that which has been presented to it by the right hemisphere. And the right hemisphere can only say no to that which has been presented to it by something outside of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because, well, this is how I conceptualize this. I don't know how the right hemisphere does what it does, but like it does, in my conception, it sees reality in some sort of raw state, like unfiltered. So I'm curious in what, but it has to, even within that raw state, it has to pick some element to focus on, something, because again, like you said before, what it's being presented with is infinite. So it has to pull that down to something. It's got to winnow it down.
Isn't that where Jordan Peterson's aim thing comes into being?
Yeah, but
you have an aim.
It's curious, where does that something come from? Because the way I can,
when I started talking about anomaly a long time ago, that's exactly it. See, where do the anomalies come from?
Because well, I know. So from the left brain side, it makes sense to me, because the left brain, I feel like, is the storehouse of all of our kind of well-formed and described, or at least internally coherent maps of the world that we've created. And so my conception of the left brain is it becomes responsible for us not seeing a lot of things, because when it's presented with something, it can kind of overwrite the anomaly and say, hey, no, that actually fits into my theory, and pretend that it or becomes so convinced that data that doesn't fit into his theory must be wrong in some way, so as to be completely disbelieved, right? So like you see this with Sam Harris when he's talking about religion. Like he literally can't see certain things that are like being painstakingly talked about to like in like this great degree of minutia, and like he can't see what the other person's referring to at all. Like it's completely invisible. And so I think that the left brain can have this capacity to cause you to not see something. And so it's interesting to think about how does that interplay happen, and how does one overwrite the other. Now, I don't know if I think this came up in their conversation, if I remember rightly, but Jordan Peterson likes to really focus. He got really excited when he learned about the orienting reflex.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the data coming in your raw signal is so great of anomaly. It's like the anomaly is so above and beyond, like an order of magnitude of what you've experienced previously, that your response to it is immediate and completely pre-programmed in some sense at a deep, like, evolutionary layer where you will just duck down, try to cover your head.
Mm-hmm.
What's funny is you see this reaction a lot of times in sports when something goes wrong, or something, you almost always see it when something good was supposed to happen and didn't, or people become disappointed, but people involuntarily do this move. You see it all the time from fans and players, and just like, it's just this, but it's kind of half of the orienting reflex there, where except it's missing the part where you duck down and try and really protect yourself. But there's like this, I don't know, there's something going on there where it's like this, it's just a complete reaction, and it's always to the back of the head. And I don't know, I know one of the books that he talks about, I think one of the Russian experimental guys, they go into some detail because he's the guy that discovered it. But that's anomaly at such a layer that it completely overrides any of the left brain's ability to say no to it. And it's like, no, we're really in big trouble right now. Do it now. So it's weird to think about, well, how does that play out, and how does the left brain in some other scenarios decide, no, it's not an anomaly, this still fits into my pattern. And Jordan Peterson makes the point that the left brain always wants it to fit into its pattern, because that reduces anxiety. You don't want to go crazy every time, like, you hear a little knock knock that you can't explain. You couldn't function at all in the world. So the left brain has a good function to say, no, we got to keep anxiety under control. We got to not believe that there's really ghosts everywhere. And it's interesting to see, well, how do those two negotiate that? And I don't know if the book goes into more detail. I know you've read the book.
Well, I haven't read the whole book, but I've read enough of it to get the picture. That in one
is that
sense,
going away from the direction you wanted to go?
Well, just let me finish the thread here, because I think what you said is very important. This book lays out the argument that the popular thinking about the left brain and right brain was drafted very early on, and did not have all of the adequate experimentation done at that time to fully understand what's happening. Right. And so in this book, he's trying to clear up a bunch of misconceptions about how the right brain and left brain work.
Right.
And one of those misconceptions is that in the past, the idea has been that the way that the brain works is through linear processing, working its way up through modules to the final result. But in fact, it loops out and back again, and it keeps re-looping through things. And it's this whole system of loops that keep coming back up through. And that it's all very much interconnected. But as he talks about the left brain and the right brain, and I noticed this when he was talking to Jordan Peterson too, I got this very clear picture in my head that it's like my husband and myself. So there must be some aspect of the left hemisphere that is people who are strong left hemisphere people are more on the man side. Right. And those with the strong right hemisphere are more on the female side. And it may not be that. It may just be because my husband is very technical and I'm a little bit more intuitive, and artistic. So that may be the difference, that the very technical side, it fits in with this left hemisphere framework. So here's a description of what the left hemisphere is, what makes it possible for us to control, manipulate, or use the world. The attention is direct and focused. The whole is broken into parts. The implicit is unpacked. Language is used for serial analysis. Things are categorized and become familiar. The affect is set aside. That's what you said earlier. The emotion is set aside. The affect is superseded by cognitive abstraction. So we were talking about this before with this whole idea of the abstraction, the Tower of Abstraction, right? You sent me that article.
Yep.
And that's very much a left hemisphere thing. The conscious mind is brought to bear on the situation. Thoughts are sent to the left hemisphere for expression in words, because only the left hemisphere can put things into language.
Right.
That's the other important thing. So the thoughts are sent to the left hemisphere for expression in words, and metaphors are temporarily lost or suspended. So the left hemisphere tends to put into words in a very analytical sense first, before metaphors can be recaptured. And then the world is represented in a static and hierarchically organized form, which is what you were just talking about. And this enables us to have knowledge and to bring the world into resolution, but it leaves what it knows denatured and decontextualized. And I think that's the really important part, is that when it's decontextualized, it no longer has connections to all the other things that are going on in the world. So if science remains very left hemispheric, it loses the context of what it is it's finding. And Penrose talks about this a lot, that once the context is lost, once the connections are lost, and also Eric Weinstein brought this up, that science nowadays is so dependent on keeping things within their categories, that there's no longer the opportunity for real breakthroughs, real intuitive breakthroughs, like the kind of thing that Einstein did.
Yeah. Barfield talks about this, where like what we think of as the collective representations, the things that are kind of shared between consciousness, are being broken apart, where, you know, in these subspecialties of subspecialties, you get into these micro areas of knowledge where you might be the only person, or you might be one of 5 people in the whole world that can actually speak intelligently about what this vocabulary and jargon means. And that the whole world's kind of being broken up in that way. And that, you know, he makes the point, if this goes on forever, it will be to the point where we can't even talk to each other anymore, which I think is very interesting. The other thing that you made me think of, I think vision, at least in humans, like 40% of our brain processing, I believe, is down to vision. In other animals, it's different. It's not quite so heavy, but we are very heavily vision focused. And have you ever had the experience of looking at somebody you know incredibly, incredibly well, like somebody maybe you've known your whole life, or like, you know, more than 10, 15, 20 years, and you're looking at them and you're kind of staring, and then suddenly you have this kind of weird feeling of like, it's like a weird, I don't know how to describe it, but like almost like a suddenly recognition that your models of who that person aren't real, and that there's something on the other side that is actually completely different. Like there's this, it's almost like a sense of unrecognition. I don't know. Yeah, this has happened to me.
You're in a situation where you're communicating with the person, and then you realize that they're a different person than you thought they were.
No, this is like
Strictly visual.
Clearly just a visual thing. And I can think of the first time it ever happened to me, and it happened kind of accidentally, but I've had it happen since. And it seems to me to be the product of a looking and still looking thing. So like the time I can think of it happening to me, I must have been 13. I was somewhere between 13 and 16. I remember exactly where I was at the house. I kind of have somewhat, my memory is a little bit photographic, so maybe this is unusual. But I remember looking at my dad at the table, and I was just staring at, I don't even think I was looking at him for any particular reason. I was kind of like in a 100-yard, 1,000-yard stare kind of mode. And it suddenly like it was like he just came into focus as this completely unrecognized object. Like I knew he was my dad and all these things, but suddenly like this sort of veneer of like, I know him so well, I know what his response will be to this question. I like suddenly that it's like something of all my left brain models of him just kind of dissolved, and it was the product of a long process of looking at him. It wasn't purposeful, like, but it was the product of vision for sure. And I'm wondering if there's something about looking and then continuing to look that subdues the left brain and says, okay, no, your model, I'm going to keep looking. There's actually like, there's something where like the right brain is saying, pushing away the left brain and saying, nope, you're not, nope, I reject that model. I reject that model. I reject that model. And when you've rejected all of them, it's like, whoa, like there's so much to this person I don't know about. He has all these thoughts and he has this internal infinity of things that I don't know about that he's thinking right now. That could be as weird and wild as what I'm experiencing right now, versus the very simplistic versions we always have of other people in our head. Like, oh, he likes this kind of food, or he gets cranky about this, or like, it's very kind of like these simplistic external factors to who they are, and specifically how it impacts and interacts with us, because that's all we care about most of the time. So that's what we pay attention to. But then it's suddenly this expansive realization of, oh my God, there's this whole person here that has, it's like a stranger to me. Like it's like this sense of like, I know this much about him, but there's really this much that I don't know.
Did you watch the randos when they were talking about C.S. Lewis in his book about the loss of his wife?
Mm-mm.
Oh,
I saw the early ones. I didn't see the anyone within the last couple months.
Well, I've only seen the first 4 or 5, but even in there, they talked about, C.S. Lewis talked about this very thing with his wife, that he could still call her to mind, but he felt like he didn't want to, because the her that he was calling to mind was a static model of who she was. And whatever it was that was behind that made her evanescent and changeable and modifiable and all of that was no longer there. And so
he was worried he would enshrine the static version and actually lose more of her than he would otherwise. Like he'd enshrine, I remember, you said H would want X, and like that would be like some cardinal rule of how they live their life now, which may not even have coincided with her wishes.
Well, see, that's a beautiful picture of what's happening in the scientific community almost with, I think why there's been so much confusion once quantum physics started to kind of take over, because quantum physics is very, very mysterious. I mean, even since they've gotten the electron microscope down to where it can actually see the electrons, they always thought an electron was a thing, and now they see the electrons are just kind of like this fuzzy motion of a thing, right? So we have these pictures in mind of what the model of the world is, but there's so much more behind it. And and that was one of the things that Eric Weinstein asked Penrose. He said, you seem to be almost alone in the scientific community for being someone who is married to reality. You want your theory to actually reflect reality. And so he's married to the 4-dimensional reality, where a lot of these string theory people, in order to make string theory or the multi-universe thing work, they have to have 10 dimensions or 16 dimensions or 22 dimensions. But he's convinced that reality is 4 dimensions. And so he's trying to find a path for his theory through these 4 dimensions.
Right.
But interestingly enough, if the 4 dimensions were in complex numbers, what would there be? There'd be 2 dimensions. So we're right back to the binary thing.
Yeah.
And for him, there's only 2 spins. There's up and down. And the up-down spin can be used to describe left, right, or backwards and forwards, because they're all a version of up and down. And once you use the up-down spin, I guess, to describe all the different variations that are possible, you end up with a sphere. Because if the up-down is going around and left and right, and all of that kind of stuff, you end up with a sphere. So he's talking about a lot of things on there that just kind of made my brain go off. And the left and right hemisphere, for example, going back to Iain McGilchrist, he calls the right hemisphere the patient recipient, and the left hemisphere is the powerful operator. And so I have this picture in my mind that the left hemisphere, if I wanted to personify the left hemisphere, I would personify the left hemisphere. The negative personification would be the tyrannical patriarch, and the positive personification would be the sovereign leader, right? And then on in a mythological sense, on the right hemisphere, the negative would be the chaotic, murderous, all-consuming mother, and the good side of it would be the nurturing, the nurturing, loving mother. So then it breaks down into Jordan Peterson's picture of the world with order and chaos, although I've never agreed with him about that, of that being chaos. I think the feminine is not chaos, but is the potential that resides within the chaos. Or maybe undifferentiated potential simply looks like chaos to us sometimes because we don't understand it well enough.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, and if it really is that the left hemisphere is represented in mythological terms by the male, by the patriarch vision, and the right hemisphere is personified by the female vision, then, now this is where it gets a little weird, but this is a what if thing. Then we could also look at the church as being like the right hemisphere. Because in the binaries, if everything is binary, then whenever we find a binary, and if that binary always reflects the same principles as the left and right hemisphere, because that's our brain, our brain is what's coming up with these thoughts.
Yeah.
So if the church is the right hemisphere vehicle, then the church responds to that which is outside of it. Let's say that the Heavenly Father or the Holy Spirit is showing the church what to choose out of the field of potential and how to move forward in a way that glorifies God.
Yeah.
But we resist, reject what he gives us. Then if Christ is the left hemisphere in this picture, in this model, we haven't asked anything of him because we're not sending it on to him. The church makes up its own mind. We're only going to do what we're going to do. And we've cast aside all this great opportunity that God has laid at our feet for whatever reason. We got insulated, we got, chaotic, whatever happened in the church for the last 300, 400, 500 years, we've We've cast aside all this beautiful stuff he tried to give us. So we're not asking Jesus to help us bring it into being and make it happen. And that's where the glitch is.
Yeah.
That completely, am I crazy?
No, it's very interesting. Do you mind if we pause for just a sec? I got to use the bathroom.
Not at all. Okay.
But
we're on again.
okay, so I think what you just said is really interesting, because one of the things I was taking notes on while you were talking earlier was something you said made me think about how, okay, so this left brain, right brain, and they're mapping onto the feminine versus masculine is interesting, both in terms of how the individual operates, but then questioning, well, how do individuals operate with each other?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think they're definitely, with Christ being the head of the church, there's definitely something where he is set in that definitively masculine role, in that the church is intended to be in some sort of feminine role. So in some sort, to come into for the because I do think the church, it has some space where God does give it the ability to choose, but it's at a lower level than what God's chosen. And so within that subspace, we do create our order,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it has to be aligned with or connected to whatever God's order is, or it won't be good. There has to be some alignment. It has to be the female aspect of, no, not my way, this way, and receptivity to that outside formation and perspective. Like you were saying, that which is outside, we have to be able to perceive and allow it to willingly come into alignment and unification with it. Which that I think is really interesting. But I think we talked about it, or maybe it was via email at some point, about, I tend to think about a lot more about the ways in which God's love towards us is feminine, in that he obviously has this masculine in terms of the creation of all things.
Mm-hmm.
But you were talking about earlier, God, what does God create out of? So the doctrine of Christianity is ex nihilo. He creates out of nothing. So whatever he creates, he in some sense supplied the raw ingredients himself. And so that chaos, in some sense, it's either God or something God allows, or something, I don't know how to best conceptualize that, but it's this sort of space or potential that God, in some sense, God exhibits the feminine, where he creates the blank paper that we can write on, right? And where he instead gets formed by and tread upon by our decisions.
Well, so
within these spaces
doesn't that make him both the masculine and the feminine?
I think he has to be.
Because,
and I think
because the feminine receives the feminine has the potential for life within her, but that potential doesn't go anywhere unless she receives that life from the masculine. And then that life, together with the life that she has, that together they create something that can come into the world that's never been before. So God himself must be both masculine and feminine, which is why he said he made us in his image.
Right.
Masculine and feminine, he made them. Right.
Yes, I think both are operating, and I think people tend to see one or the other. And I think traditionally Western Christianity has mostly seen the masculine side of it, mm-hmm. which is why have found that feminine side of what sort of cost is God accruing to himself over the eons of time to allow creation to have its own agency as well. So that, I mean, we look in the world that life seems to have its own agency, its ability to do and choose and do things that are novel and maybe even and unanticipated. I don't know. But something's something. God has to do something, I think, in my opinion, to allow that possibility, and that in some sense is feminine nature, right? To give that space where you have the freedom to act. And now, in some sense, the ultimate, because what got me to this place where I thought about this was, I feel like I thought about the suffering of God and how it must be so much greater than our suffering, because it has such a longer time horizon. It is connected with every here and now for all eternity, but it also it so there's this great suffering and joy simultaneous with each other all the time, and that those two are together, which is something I feel like I've had some physiological experience of as a reality. um and I tried, in trying to make sense of that, I thought, what is going on, and what might the experience of God have to be like to have this infinite love and desire for people's goodness, but then to also give them the space where they can make poor decisions and have consequences that stream out into an infinity of, like my bad choices don't just affect me, they affect my family, they affect my community, they affect all my distant, um people and in some sense it affects my ancestors, like the people that came before me, and affects all the people that are going to come out of me. They're like, we're all connected kind of in this tree like structure. And that to experience that, I mean, for God, and to allow that, I feel like has to be something of his giving to us real agency.
When you become a dad,
Huh?
when you become a dad, you will experience that.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do exactly what you said with your children and go through that suffering of watching them stumble and fall and learn their own lessons, they will not grow up to be healthy, normal members of society.
Right.
And yet it's a very painful process, because it, as you said, your children reflect on you. You have to let all that stuff in you that needs to be reflected well get peeled away. We have an experience of suffering there that God wouldn't have, because God already is perfect in nature, so his
Mhm.
character wouldn't be as mucked up as my character is. But still, there's the suffering of seeing your child suffer. When your
Yeah.
child falls and stumbles and gets hurt, there's great suffering involved in that. Seeing them bear consequences is very, very difficult, very challenging.
Right. And in some sense, your capacity to suffer is a in relationship to some your knowledge of the good, right? You can't, unless you know good to the nth degree, like you can't know how far off it's being missed and being, destroyed. Like God knows how many hairs are on your head, so he knows,
Mhm.
he has this extra capacity to see the ways in which, we deviate from the good. And so that, I think that entails an extra level of capacity for suffering, which I know a lot of people don't like, because one of the things I think a lot of people don't like about it is they feel that it's a theology of God which makes God beholden to human passions, which that's not what I'm trying to put forward. But I feel like, for me, I think I find it comforting, because I I think it's important in our theology of the goodness of God that we have, if suffering is a part of the world, it has to be having some component goodness at its root,
Mhm.
that there's something good in it. And we couldn't, I don't think we could believe it to be good if God himself didn't partake in it.
Well,
If it
that's
was,
back to that John Stott idea that I think he said, in this world of pain and suffering, I could not believe in a God who had not experienced it for himself. I mean, Hebrews 4, I think it is, that talks about that Jesus understands our suffering because he went through all that suffering before us. So we have a high priest who is well acquainted with what we go through.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the kind of thing you mean, or are you? Is it? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
I think I think Jesus is a great example. But I think Jesus' mission is to show the Father. And it says there's this weird, and then of course Jesus leaves, and then the Holy Spirit comes, and the Holy Spirit's mission is to show Jesus.
mhm,
And so there's this weird self-reflection like nature of the Trinity that I feel like there's something more fundamental about reality and God rather than just the cross. Like it's being showcased, and it matters the way it went down in the cross, but it's a fuller expression of who God is all the time rather than just a kind of like one-off, like, because in some sense, I mean, that kind of suffering isn't meaningful on the scale of all of human history, right? Like if it's just like God had one bad night in a hotel one night, which was what the cross would be, and on the time scale of human history, it's not. It's I think that's less compelling or interesting or or reflective of a grander narrative than a God who is with us in all our suffering and actually feels it more completely and deeply than we do. Because a lot of the suffering you experience in your life, you're almost you can become numb to it, and uh, again, like I think most people have this experience of knowing where they have some event that introduces an immense amount of suffering, but they realize it was like this thing that woke them up from the numbness that they'd kind of become accustomed to in their pain.
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Well, and I was just thinking about um, my daughter will call me out on things sometimes if she's gone through some tough thing, if I don't react deeply enough with her through that
mhm.
tough thing, she reminds me. I mean, she might be kind of angry with me about it, but it's kind of like, why aren't you as upset about this as I am? Don't you
Mm,
care about me? And
yeah.
I think that's the way we are, that if someone comes alongside us in our suffering and can reflect that suffering back to us, we know that they love us very deeply, right?
Yeah.
And so it's got to be that picture that um, I think is it First Corinthians that talks about the God of all comfort who comforts us in all of our sorrow and struggle so that we can comfort others in their sorrow and struggle.
Mhm.
So it's this constant looping back of love and suffering combined to comfort and pass it on down through the ages.
Yeah, and it's a weird thing where again you can't be very helpful to people in suffering unless you've experienced a lot of it yourself.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I just that's something that really occurred to me very strongly today. It's like I mean, I think that we all know that to be true, but just there's certain things like some of the things that make you well equipped to be a human and interact with other people. Almost all of it comes through suffering, because we all know people who haven't have like if you've had so little suffering, it's very hard for you to be integrated into society at all because it becomes so icky to have anything press in upon your individualism to even become a part of a larger thing that you're just this brat, this forever adolescent of like nascent ego and just completely misapprehending and understanding what other people are experiencing.
Well, isn't that a part of like psychopathology, that you can't be empathic with other people in their struggles, and then that makes you someone who can't integrate into society at all, right?
Yeah.
Can I just go back to this thing about the church and the head for a second? Because one of the things I wrote down I think might be interesting to look at. So when the church permits the coming into being of what is disclosed to it, and this word disclosed I thought was very important because Iain McGilchrist uses that word, but I also run into that word in Ellen Lightcap Meek,
Yep.
Esther Lightcap Meek, because she talks about all knowing. The only way we can ever know anything is if it is first presented to us, first graciously disclosed to us from outside. And that it's almost like something glimmers out in front of us and allows us to recognize it and then begin to know it. And then it becomes this relationship with that thing that was glimmering in front of us.
Yeah.
So when it uses this word disclose, that's kind of the picture I get. Then the head, which is Christ, either rejects or permits that thing. So if something is disclosed to the church and the church decides, yes, this would be a good thing. Let's say maybe Wesley got this idea of developing a method of discipline for one's spiritual growth. And Wesley also had this idea of having a personal, emotional response to the Godhead. And so if that is accepted by the church and incorporated into the church, then Jesus either permits that or doesn't permit it. If he permits it, for some reason it's allowed to go on and develop and proliferate. But if the church would make some horrendous decision and maybe the aspect of the churches that doesn't do well or that doesn't grow is when we don't permit the good things that God gives us. But maybe there are times when God gives us something and we twist it out of shape. We torment it and turn it into something it shouldn't be. We have lots of examples of that. Then it still has to go through Jesus, and Jesus either permits or doesn't permit. And we know that he is not going to permit anything that isn't fundamentally good.
Right.
So he is going to say no to anything that would be damaging to the longevity, the life of the church. So the church might go through periods of time when we're screwed up and things are twisted out of shape, but we always have hope for the final result because we know that the head has the final say on whether or not something can be allowed to go out of control or not allowed to go out of control.
Right.
And he's always going to protect us. So that brings me back to the picture of marriage, which is a touchy subject, because then that's what that's actually saying is that if the left hemisphere is like the husband and the right hemisphere is like the wife, then and this picture works for me because of my own marriage. My husband is very, very technical, very left hemisphere kind of person, very,
Mm-hmm.
he can get kind of rigidly ideological about things and get things all lined up and everything has to fit into that package. And I'm much more intuitive and I'm more like spread out. I'm looking at all the possibilities. I've got like ADHD wires coming into my head from everywhere.
Right.
And when we're most successful is when he is willing to listen to me and I can bring these strange ideas in and then we talk it through. And after we talk it through and process it together, we come to a conclusion that isn't my original conclusion, because there were
Mhm.
probably parts of my original thinking that were a little off base,
Yep.
but it's also more than what he would have come up with, because he was stuck in his silo. And so we come up with something entirely new that gets brought into being. And to me, that's the picture. It's not so much a subservient wife and a authoritarian husband who makes the final decision, but it is where we're both executing our role in such a way that permits the husband to have the final say, but the husband is still dependent on the new information coming in from the wife, because
Right.
if he doesn't receive that new information, then he's stuck with what he knows now. And the problem is, you remember Jordan Peterson says, if you think you know everything you need to know, that was the description of Satan in
Right.
Paradise Lost.
Right. Which is easy to get into. Um, it's weird because there's aspects of my own personality in it, especially in relationships as well, where I could be very of the right brain, kind of like intuition and kind of feelings focused about, which is all over the web map. And then there's other areas where I'm very kind of like rigid and things have to fit in this box or I'm not comfortable. It's difficult for me to say which one I am
Well, I
more
think
frequently, like in a relationship.
you're probably just balanced.
I
I
don't
mean,
know. I feel like well, I think balance would be to integrate those in a single frame. I feel like if I go into these contexts, I go this way. And if I go into these contexts, I go the other way. And like, I think what I really struggle with is the integration. I think it seems like there's a lot of that in today's society where like there's kind of this black and whiteness. It's like it has to be this or that. And oftentimes I know neither of those are true, but like I can feel the sense of like I have to pick one or the other. There isn't like a third option of
I think
integrate.
that's because the world around us has solidified into that way of thinking, and
Yeah.
we have grown up in a world in which that is the main way of thinking. And his whole argument in this book, The Master and His Emissary, is that that we started out. He says Kant, that he says the left hemisphere was supreme, or was most influential, from Plato to Kant, and includes the time frame of the classical mechanics Newtonian universe.
Right.
That's the left hemisphere, and Democritus. But the right hemisphere was supreme with the pre-Socratic philosophers, and then it fell out of supremacy when Plato came along, but it has come back into more prominence with the phenomenologists and the quantum mechanics and Niels Bohr, which is why now the quantum physicists are talking about the mystery that relates to all these probabilities where you can't know something for certain.
Right.
So, but our Western civilization especially was developed out of this idea of the left brain, the left hemisphere type of thinking. We
Right.
kind of threw away all of the intuitive, creative, emotional aspect, and just centered on this very scientific. Because what the scientists have forgotten is that, yes, you can have an objective method, but human beings can never be completely objective.
Right. Right.
So you're always going to have that subjectivity in there. And if you fool yourself into thinking you're perfectly objective, you're going to miss the signposts that you need to see. And that's what's so impressive about Roger Penrose, is he's kind of got his feelers out into all these different potentialities in the universe.
Yeah. I feel like there's some component of love in all knowledge too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think within love, there's two components. there's mercy and justice. And mercy is the more feminine kind of bending to shape the anomaly and take it in. And justice is the thing that, provides the structure and lays down the law and pushes things. And like both of those are some aspect. It's the left and right hemisphere have to be operating together for knowledge to happen.
That's a really interesting binary there, mercy and justice. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Wait, who was it when JP and Jonathan Peugeot were talking about, like, how does an apple become part of your body? Well, at first you have all this justice on the apple. You literally rip it apart, like it becomes subject to you, and that goes into your body. And then at some point, some part of you is sacrificed and given up and joins with the apple to make it able to be unified into you. And now you actually absorb the apple. And so something now it's like now mercy is shown to the apple and it becomes absorbed into you. And some of you're now, the justice is on you. So you're cutting off parts of yourself to make this sacrifice to accept it in. And then some of it gets thrown away and then the rest kind of becomes part of you. But that there's this interplay between justice and mercy throughout that entire process of two things coming together.
That same thing is happening underground between plants, where some plants put out a signal from their roots saying that they need a certain something in there, a certain nutrient or a certain chemical or something. And other plants that are in the vicinity will willingly give up some of what they have to meet the need of this neighboring plant that isn't even of the same genus or species of a plant.
Right.
Like it could be a tree and some weird shrub or, I don't know, spore or something. This kind of thing is happening underground all the time.
Is this from the did you get this from the article Luke was sending around, the wood wide web? Is that where you got that from? It was
Maybe.
it was like a New Yorker article.
But I had also heard Mary Cohen talk about it. Maybe
Okay.
in one of her conversations with me, she was talking about something very similar.
Gotcha.
So, but then I read this article what went into more detail. I think that maybe it was that article that you're talking about that. I should try to find the article so I could link to it in case we publish this conversation.
Yeah, I feel like there's some connection with Rupert Sheldrake, and either like I think it was one of his kids was involved in some of the research that goes on with that. But you also said something else about like reality disclosing itself to you.
Mm-hmm.
That made me think. I mean, of truth being kind of personal and having its own kind of will and intention. And a while back, Luke was asking a question of saying like, okay, when I learn or see something that's true, what is it that discerns that it's true? Like, what is it? What in me? Is it something in me or something outside of me that actually makes that judgment or that discernment that this is real, this is true, this is it? And one of the things that I think I've come to from from Jordan Peterson mainly is this idea that you have a relationship with the truth, and that relationship becomes kind of its own third thing. And like you were saying earlier, truth discloses things to me, and I can choose to interact with those, or I can kind of do the ostrich in the sand and bury my head and ignore it. And then truth can find other ways in to send that same, that same information back to me, and I can ignore that, and or I can open myself up to it. And there's a certain dynamic that's created between, it's not me and it's not truth per se, but when I discern that something's true, there's something in my relationship with truth that allows me to see this particular element of truth that I have to kind of practice and open myself up to. And there's again, that justice and mercy at play there of, you know, I have to use justice to frame things in a way that I can, so that it'll be intelligible to me. But I also have to have that mercy, that right brain element of like accepting the elements that I don't already know, prioritizing the unknown, and having mercy towards it, even though it doesn't fit into my current framework of how I think reality works. So it's like this weird balancing act, and that's that how I practice that on a daily basis becomes integrated into the biological structure of who I am and forms this relationship with truth. And I think there is something about truth that is personal, and that if I routinely ignore some aspect of truth, it stops disclosing itself to me. And kind of like there's something in that relationship becomes clogged and broken, and now that area of truth I can no longer see. And so, because part of what I was getting at with this too is I think there's some aspect of when you look at the ways in which we're, in spite of all of our defects and all of the ways we are, just from a pure, like I look at this from a technical perspective, from a pure informational processing level, you just see all the transitions of the data in all the areas where it can get mucked up. It's almost miraculous that you and I can have a conversation about obviously I'm not understanding everything you're saying, you're not understanding everything I'm saying, but the fact that we can get even as much as we do through these little like windows into each other's minds is amazing. And it makes me think there has to be some aspect, there has to be this third thing, truth, that's playing some role in both of our consciousness, that we both have a relationship to, and for better or for worse. In some areas we have a great relationship with truth, and in other areas we're like, no, I don't ever look at the truth, and when I get into this context, and so that forms our relationship with truth. And I think that's why Jordan Peterson makes such a big deal about saying the truth, about, or at least not consciously lying, because something, whatever that road or whatever that connection is between you and the truth, that relationship I'm describing, it is dynamic, and you have a lot of power to twist it and to make it into something that no longer has the ability to recognize the truth when it sees it,
Mhm.
or to even invert it into the opposite, if you're so inclined over a very long period of time. And so that's where it becomes very scary to think about that, that it, because I think that there's a fundamental arrogance in the lie, which is I can twist this a little bit and it won't, I'll be able to keep them straight in my head. I won't actually, I'll know what's the lie is, and I'll know what the truth is. I'll know both of those things, and it'll just be the lie that I push on other people that will get out there, and then I'll still be able to keep them straight. And I think that's not possible, because there's something so fundamental to that twisting action that you almost can't tell a lie at all effectively without first believing it yourself. And there's that relationship, that thing that discerns the truth, gets warped.
Mhm. Well, it's what Jordan Peterson calls twisting the fabric of reality, and that it will always snap back and get you. But, while it remains twisted, it has a memory. And you remember when I sent you that video of the old calculator that had the piano string memory in it?
Uh-huh.
Because that string was twisted, it gets a memory in it, and it'll keep that memory until it's
Right.
called for. And I had this amazing experience at church yesterday during worship, where somehow I began reflecting on that aspect of truth, that when you lie to yourself, or you lie through your actions, or through in your unwillingness to do what you know is the right thing, or through
Right.
even through mistakes that you made. Like, primarily what I was thinking about was some mistakes that I made in my younger years with raising my children, because every parent starts out with no knowledge at all, so you do what you can, right? But some of the mistakes that I made were a result of my own denial of some of my own character flaws that I didn't want to take care of. I just didn't want to face up to it and do something
Sure.
about it. And so that had consequences through the years. And it was like all of a sudden, during this time of worship, I could see all these consequences laid out in front of me, like this, I don't know, event horizon of a black hole.
How did that make you feel?
Oh, well, the moment at the moment that it happened, it was this overwhelming sense of grief and loss and regret for the way that I allowed the errors to multiply themselves, and for the loss of all those who were affected by my behavior,
Right.
and the effect that that will have, that whatever thing is a little bit twisted in them might have on people that go beyond them. And I could see this thing going out through all eternity. The size of my error, and at the same time, I had this picture of the size of God being so much infinitely beyond the size
Right.
of my error, and that his love is big enough to handle all of that and to make something purposeful and beautiful out of every bit of it
Yeah.
for everyone involved. And it was an overwhelming moment of worship, but I can't forget that picture of what happens,
Yeah.
which is why I think Jordan Peterson always says, keep a pristine relationship with the truth.
Yeah.
Keep your relationship with the truth as pristine as you can.
And be deadly scared of the consequences of the lie, because again, it's the arrogance that thinks you can handle it. There's this arrogance in it, like, I can fool you, and I can also be smart enough not to fool myself, which I think, you know, you watch this, play itself out with kids. That's an element when they start to think they understand the world, and that they can do that little twist themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's weird. I love the way he talks about it, because he's like, this isn't like some sort of simple, because you hear somebody like give the advice of don't lie. And part of what you're saying is, when people hear that, they're like, they hear that simple moral tale, and they're like, oh, that's the sort of thing you tell the kids. But then we think as adults, we get to this level of like, I actually know that there's times when I actually should twist the truth, and times when I shouldn't. It's kind of like this, I'm smarter, I'm more complex, I understand and look down on reality. And I think part of that structure of our belief is a structure of belief about reality itself, which is, reality itself isn't good. Therefore, I can't deal with reality in an upfront and I don't know, honest, upright manner. I have to twist it, because it is itself twisted. And so I have to be twisted in response to that. And so it's a feedback loop of the opposite of thinking again. And you see this play out as soon as you put that out there. That lie necessitates further lies, right? So there's this twistedness that builds itself into your way of looking at everything, and a feeling that to be a smart and well-formed adult is actually that's a component of it. And somebody like Peterson comes along and says, oh, you tell the truth. It's like, oh, that's what you tell the kids, but we know better. Like, just like we tell the kids there's Santa Claus, telling the truth isn't always the best policy. And I know, like, there's this kind of like this sort of nuance, even people that are kind of like preachers. I feel like there's a sense in which people they'll preach something and they're really not preaching to themselves. They're preaching to like you down there in the pews. You need to straighten this part out. But I'm up here on this other level where, I play by a little bit different rules. And I think we all do that. You watch, we all watch other, listen to people talk, and you can just tell there's a certain hypocrisy where you can actually see people pointing out flaws in other people that they have themselves that they can't see, because
Yeah.
when those flaws manifest themselves in them, there's like, oh, I did that because in this situation, blah, 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 million excuses why. Like, you think that person over there doesn't have a similar story about the million excuses why they did what they did? It's the exact same thing. But it's like, it's funny how we literally, it twists our view of the world, so we're unaware of that.
So it's funny that we use the word justify for that, isn't it? As though it has something to do with justice. But when I lie, I can justify my lies by all these excuses that I have. Or the big lie that tripped me up for so many years was that somehow eating more than what I needed wouldn't affect me. I was somehow beyond the rules of that.
Right.
And if I gained weight from that and didn't look attractive and affected all the people around me by looking like a fat slob, that, well, everybody should feel bad for me, feel sorry for me, because life is hard for me. But instead of accepting that life was hard for me because I had been making choices that were the wrong choices, that were fundamentally clear, if I had looked at anybody else, I would have been able to tell them what the right choice was to make and how to behave and how they would have a better life. But I wasn't going to apply it to myself, because I somehow lived in a different category of people. I was somehow different. The rules didn't apply to me. And I think it maybe happens whenever the consequences are separated from the act, where you don't see an immediate connection to reality in your behavior. So, if you eat the wrong thing, you don't find out what it's going to do to you for a week or 2 weeks or 10 weeks down the road.
Yeah.
But, and there are a lot of things like that in life. You can make the wrong choice, but you won't know that the choice that you made until much longer in the future.
Well,
but if we're always determined to tell the truth, act on the truth, then.
Well, I think the thing we lose sight of the most is how much we're creatures of habit, and how my decision to lie right now isn't really just a decision to lie right now. It's the decision to lie potentially for the rest of my life. It's because, this is where Peterson gets into these, like, why you need to focus on the incremental improvement, because the choice you make that's good today is also makes it that much easier to make the good choice tomorrow and the day after that. And we get in these cycles where, why do I do what I'm doing right this second? Well, I'm mostly because of something I did yesterday. And why did I do that? Because of something I did the day before that. So that you get this kind of cumulative action from these cycles. And so we don't realize, it's like we don't realize in some sense how close heaven and hell are all the time with every little choice. And that this little thing starts spinning me in that direction, and this little thing starts spinning me in that direction. And how easily we can be caught up in both the good and the bad in ways that carry us to places we couldn't have imagined.
Well, do you think there's any connection between this and the idea of how the left and right hemispheres react to reality? Because,
in what sense?
Because, well, when we're talking about lying, we're talking about having a twisted relationship with reality, right?
Uh-huh.
It's not a healthy relationship with reality. In other words, we're not observing reality the way that it actually is.
Right.
We're observing some sort of personal construction of the way we want reality to look. We build our own little personal utopia, and then we come into alignment with that personal construction that we came up with, rather than coming into alignment with reality.
Right.
So is that is it the right brain that's lying? Or is it the left brain that's lying? Or the right brain is feeding information about reality to the left brain, and then the left brain is deciding what to accept and reject in that body of
It
information.
seems to me that it's left-brained, the lie. It's a masculine. It's a positive thing, and it's why, you know, I think why Peterson says to focus on that, because you can always, you don't. Here's the thing: there may be things me and you in this conversation, we're telling a lie, but it's a lie that we've told for so long that to us it feels like the truth when we say it. You know, so we don't know at that point. It's so baked into my physiology. It doesn't, like, I'm not aware. I don't even have, like, it's not even. It doesn't present itself to my consciousness as a choice to see it any other way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to take note of the times that when you consciously choose, where you see there's an option and you choose that one, and that is kind of a masculine. That is that twisting. That is that marring of reality. That is conscious and sets the way for me to now get in a cycle where I do that over and over and over again, to the point where, again, I can't. It's no longer something I can even see. And I think it forms its way into the maps of the world, the maps which, again, you know, is the lens we see everything with, because we have to. I mean, there's no other option. There's no other way to see the world, you know, is with these eyes, and these eyes that data has to get processed somehow. And so the left brain's always got to be involved, or we can't make sense of it enough to do any sort of action. You know, we just, without those maps, we just become stupefied with too much data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's obviously much more that we can talk about with this, but I don't want to spend your whole day. I want you to keep, as you're listening to the Roger Penrose thing, though, I want you to keep thinking about places where you notice in the conversation that it starts to reduce everything to the binary.
Yeah.
He doesn't specifically say that, but when you're listening, you can hear them. All of a sudden, they're talking about this or that.
Yeah.
And move along, and they're talking about this or that. And it's like the whole thing keeps reducing down to this or that. And in a sense, there are many of these mountain peaks, I guess, where reality shows us something.
Mm-hmm.
But each of those mountain peaks is Nima Arkani Hamed. Did you ever hear his lecture on the morality of fundamental physics?
Yeah, you sent that to me a long time ago.
Yeah. So he talks about how when they came up with the classical mechanics Newtonian universe, that the concept of gravity and all of the equations that went with that were this perfect, useful tool, crystalline, perfect truth. And then when quantum mechanics came along, and then they understood, well, when special relativity came along and they understood Einsteinian reality, that was also a perfect crystalline truth that works in its own frame, and this works in its own frame. And even though you're up here at this higher mountain peak now with Einsteinian relativity, you can look back at the other mountain and it still functions for what it needs to function for, because it's still a perfect set of information. It's a crystalline form, the way he describes it. And so there are, in this world that Penrose is inhabiting, there are many of these mountains, and each of them is kind of complete in itself and useful for what it's useful for. But every one of them seems to have a binary nature. So that was really fascinating to me as he was talking about all these different things. And from I'd really love to get your perspective on it from the computer science side.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind.
There was
I think
one place where I wrote a note. I said to ask Michael to rethink this in, I'm going to have to find it, rethink it in computer science terms, but I'll have to find it and send it to you.
yeah. Now, one thing that I've been going through a bunch too is I don't know if we ever talked about this. David Bentley Hart's new book.
Which is, what's the name of it?
It's called "The All Shall Be Saved."
All shall be saved.
That all shall be saved. It's
all shall be saved.
Are you familiar with Hart?
I know that he's someone that Esther Lightcap Meek was getting a lot from. So
yeah, he's an Orthodox guy. I think he was originally Anglican, but so this book's about salvation. There's a YouTube video I can send to you, which is a good, I don't know, it's like a Cliff Notes version of the book, although it's the video is very intellectual. It's very kind of like, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it because I feel like it's a very interesting, important book at the moment.
Yeah, send me the video. It'd be easier right now because I'm rereading Maps of Meaning still, and I'm reading this Master and His Emissary, which is a mammoth book, and it's very small print.
Yeah.
Very
so Sherry has been reading the book too, and we're going to have a conversation about it.
Oh,
probably
wonderful.
This week. So, but yeah, I want to get like other parties. I want people's perspectives on it too. People that agree with and disagree with him, because I feel like I'm not sure. I feel very persuaded by his arguments, but I want to have like I want to hear some intellectual firepower coming the other way as well to see what that looks like. I'm hopeful that Paul will read it, although the book has some really heavy criticism for Calvinism specifically in it. So I don't know if he might find that that might trigger some of his tribalistic tendencies and make it hard for him to have a real engagement with it. I've looked really hard.
Paul is having tribalistic tendencies.
He doesn't. Well, if you tread on the Calvinism a little bit, he basically, he knows that he has him. So he basically will just stop the conversation there. He'll just like punt. He's like, well, these conversations aren't really useful to have because, if you get into the whole Armenian versus, Calvinist perspective on, free will and predestination, all that stuff, he's like, I don't really want to get into this. This is kind of muddy waters. And I agree with him because I think most of the people that argue about those things don't even know what the words they're using mean. So it's kind of, it's not productive or fruitful. It's just people get mad, But I don't know. I think something really is interesting and important in this book. And I don't know what to make of it because it's almost like, it feels like something kind of too good to be true, but it feels also like something that's more in line with kind of this Jordan Peterson view of taking the whole scientific framework and the religious framework together, of kind of knitting the whole of reality together. There's something of that in David Bentley Hart's work that I find, I don't know, very of the moment. But
well, does it relate to C.S. Lewis's idea that there is a purgatory?
Yeah, well, his idea is that he articulates that the early Christians believed in hell, but that many of them, and for centuries, probably the majority, didn't think it was forever. That hell had ultimately had a redemptive purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And so like a lot of people had this kind of as like a hopeful thing. Augustine called them the misericordias, like the which meant the tender-hearted people who believed this. Oh, sorry, thought I was talking to her. Yeah, and he sees it as quite unfortunate that Augustine becomes the main thinker he loves Augustine, but he's like just so disappointed that, you know, his critical work was the city of God, which is the city of God is this forever, it's almost like this forever break apart between the city of God and the city of man, these two cities that break apart and can never be together. Whereas his view of the gospel is the exact opposite, that everything, all of reality, even, you know, the fundamental nature of the cosmos itself is redeemed and integrated into God. So that in the end, Christ is all in all and he is subject to God.
Mhm.
So that's really the message of the gospel, which rings very true with many, many statements in the gospel, which there's a very kind of universal element of everything being reintegrated into this redeemed nature of a recreated order, of a union between heaven and earth. And he makes the argument that you can't throw away any bits of it and still call this divine plan good. And he goes through all these reasons why the scriptures he makes a scriptural argument, he makes like a logical argument, he makes a theological argument. It's like it's a very intellectual approach to it, but
Well, have
I'd
you
like to hear.
ever read any John Eldridge?
uh-uh
I think John Eldridge might knit, I mean, if I'm understanding what you're saying about David Bentley Hart, John Eldridge might knit it together with the understanding that you had before you read that book. Because John Eldridge talks about Wild at Heart would probably be, since you're a guy, that'd probably be
Mhm.
the book that would be the easiest entree, I mean, the most logical entree for you. His
Okay.
writing is very easy to understand. It's more on the emotional, intuitive side of things, but
Right.
he said something that threw me for a loop when I first read it, but the longer I live with it, the more it seems real to me, is that I I always was taught early in my Christian walk that the heart is desperately wicked, who can know it?
Yeah.
That I had to be very afraid of my heart,
Right.
and that I couldn't trust my heart, and
That's
that,
very Calvin.
yeah, that my heart was always seeking after sin and degradation and all that kind of thing. But in John Eldridge's books, which I started reading probably 15 years ago, he talks about that once we are in Christ, that our hearts are transformed, and
Hmm.
that our hearts are brave and beautiful and good and worthy, and all of that. And he goes into detail about that. Um, and then he goes into detail about all of the different, he almost uses archetypal language about Christ and the believer, and the journeys of adventure and
Hmm.
the warrior image and all of those things. He uses that kind of language, and so it's very ennobling, kind of very encouraging word.
Yeah. um it's weird because this also, for some reason, when you were thinking about it, it made me think about, did you remember Jordan Peterson's his his Easter lecture? I think he actually took it down from Easter a while back when he did something on Easter, but he made some point in there
On
in
the
terms of
resurrection.
like that within Christ, you know, this is like the archetype of the hero. There's this sense that in the cross God achieved everything, and yet there's still this role we have to play. That these two things are simultaneous. That like
Mhm.
that the end is secure, but also there's like it's almost also in doubt that we also have to do things a certain way. And there's this tension which is very strange of, and it's also within the whole heaven and hell thing, right? You know, like are you saved or you're not, like all the, and I don't know, there seems to be something going on in that language.
Well, what comes back to my mind is a message I heard, oh gosh, 40 years ago maybe, that was talking about, it was using the analogy of battle, that like in the Second World War, the war was over and they had already signed the peace treaties and everything, and yet there were still battles and skirmishes going on. Sometimes because it was in places where they hadn't been informed yet that the end had come. Sometimes it might have been because the day that peace was to take place was maybe 3 days after the thing was signed.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the day that all fighting stops. Meanwhile, there are battles going on. So
Yeah.
the end of the war is different than the battle. And that within those battles, you're assured victory has already come.
Right.
There's no worry about victory, but there is worry about how you conduct yourself in the moment.
Exactly. And there's something about how there's something of eternal significance to how you play your role.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that's interesting to think about. What is so special or significant about this finite realm that we're in now that has these ramifications forever? Because I think that is, this is C.S. Lewis makes this point. He's like, everybody will be either like this, this awesome, beautiful thing in the future, or this horrible thing in the future, and what we will have played roles in sending people in both directions, and that will be some like fundamental whatever, everything we think of as long-standing, like cultures and languages and art and all these things. That's all for the moment, and what's really fundamental and long term is what we don't see, which is the human soul. That's the only thing that's really forever, and the marks we kind of write into other people's lives in terms of how they turn out is the thing that will ultimately matter.
Mm-hmm.
um which I think is really rings true to me.
Yeah, it's a terrifying thought, though, right?
Yeah, I mean, like that you're writing these little things onto other people that they'll carry forever.
Well,
um
Jordan Peterson makes the statement, and it's a really if you don't have a picture of God being a personal God who's really there and with you and bigger than all of this, it's an inordinately terrifying thought, because he always says either everything matters or nothing matters.
yeah,
And obviously the easier way to go is when nothing matters. But if nothing matters, you can't really live, because
yeah.
it's so nihilistic and desperate.
Well, and it
But
can
if
be difficult
everything
to,
matters, then every move you make, you're
yeah.
responsible
Well,
for.
you can have the you can feel immediately crushed,
Mm-hmm.
to yeah. So I think you have to fundamentally believe again in God's interaction with your consciousness to help you to make something good out of your continual failures. Because even when you have the best of intentions and you're trying your hardest, we all know that we still find ways to muck it up. So it's like, I think you have to kind of accept and believe that God is working. But it's funny though, in the Brothers Karamazov and other Dostoevsky works, he has this idea that a lot of like his characters will take on, like that they believe that the reality of heaven is to be grasped right here, right now, whenever any person takes upon themselves responsibility for everything. That they see any sort of thing going wrong in their environment is they take it to themselves. Like, if I was more patient and kind and whatever, like it's a complete inversion of how we're trained to see the world, which is that's their fault. They need to get their crap in order. Like, when that becomes inverted and we see that as our responsibility, it's almost like, I think it's like we step into God's shoes, and when we do that, we actually get some of his power to help flip those situations, if that makes sense. Like, when we take up that burden that seems impossible for any human to bear, we actually get this supernatural strength to do so. And I
Well,
think that's
there's one more element right there. There's a dividing line right there, because I remember like maybe 20 years ago or something, I became conscious during the Kuwaiti War. I became conscious one day that I was so burdened about that war that it was
Uh-huh.
making it difficult for me to move forward day by day. And I couldn't figure out why that would be. And all of a sudden I realized, well, I feel responsible for not solving that problem.
Yeah.
And that in some way, I feel fundamentally responsible for not solving every problem that I see.
Right.
But that feeling is completely immobilizing. And I couldn't move forward at all. And then I had to go, I spent some time in counseling working through the book Boundaries
Hmm.
by Cloud and Townsend, which lays out me and not me, and that there is a division between me and not me.
Right.
And if I take on the responsibility for what happens to everybody, then I'm sort of putting myself in God's place,
Yeah.
and I am not honoring the boundary of who I am and who I am in relation to God. But then see my responsibility in, if I don't see my responsibility in those situations, then maybe I don't do anything to help people. So if I see someone who's in desperate need, if I feel if I feel guilty that they're in need,
Yeah.
I may or may not help them. I might not help them because it's too hard to think about. So I just turn aside like
Right.
a Pharisee, right?
Well, I
Or
think sometimes.
if I feel guilty, anything that I do for them is going to be corrupted because I'm not doing it out of a good heart.
Right.
But if I see them with God's eyes, so there's something about not putting myself in God's place, but trying to see the world through his eyes or let him work through me.
Right. Well, I think
Something about
sometimes we
that
we
thing.
can we can fixate on the things that are outside of our control. I think as a way sometimes of feeling more powerless, so that we kind of at the end feel like we can't do anything, so that we feel justified in doing nothing. I mean, I know I can see this play out myself out in my own life. I almost, it's like it's a way of taking up all this mental bandwidth that I have and throwing it at something that I know I can't do anything about it, but at the end, I can still kind of pat myself on the back and be like, well, I care enough to notice, but
Hmm.
I just can't do anything about it. Versus the other way, which is much more, it's more being in the moment to what can I actually do now, and sometimes all you can do now is just notice and actually care.
And pray.
And sometimes it's you actually do something where or maybe you say something, and you say something that's actually not the thing the person wants to hear, but you actually are saying it out of a deep love and not a sort of like sarcastic, I know you're not going to listen to me anyway, so I'm just going to give it to you this way,
Hmm.
kind of like there's just, I think there's I don't know, because I know there's the uh, I don't even know if I'm making this, but I feel like there is a mode of being where it is a very, it's driven by love, and it is very in the moment, whether that is taking actions of justice or mercy to take in your reality and interact with it, like um what you do, as if what you do really really matters,
Hmm.
that like even like something small you do that's gracious instead of impatient has this ripple that goes forever as well. So you look at not just the potential to do something wrong and cause those bad ripples, but you also see there's also these little tiny little pebbles I can throw in the water that have these good ripples that go forever as well.
Hmm.
And to be kind of have a feeling of of that power that God has, through his operation in you, is is part of that love. Once you see what I think what's partly what happens is once you see it in operation in certain places in your life, now it's like, well, I could actually do this not just 10% of the time, I could do this 20% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And after I do it 20% of the time, I could do it 30% of the time. You know, like, but we don't like, there's a sense of, there's that burden that you feel once you start to realize that you have more power and capacity in the world than you previously thought. That, yeah, it is a burden to think that everything you does matters, you know, and
Well,
I think
so
we
this
don't
is
like,
where that other binary comes in, the binary between gratitude and humility. There's something very interesting going on there, because I think gratitude and humility kind of encompass everything. So when you're acting out of a place of humility, you know that the only way that you can do any of these things is with God's power working in you. So it's never I can do this, but
yes, it's
through Christ
gratitude.
I can do all things, right?
I'm not doing this to get something. I'm doing this because I already was given something.
Yeah. So you have the gratitude, which allows you to walk in humility. But it also works the other way, that humility, and this is this is where it gets hard, because sometimes we will exercise something because it gets us something, not just because it's a natural consequence. But humility actually attracts gratitude. So when you behave in humility towards another person and you honor them,
Yeah.
what you get back is gratitude. It's a natural expression that comes back from acting in humility. And I also think that all the expressions of character in the scripture, all the expressions of the fruits of the Spirit, that none of those are possible without a prerequisite of humility. We have to be teachable, we have to be moldable, we have to recognize um, that compared to God, we are nothing and He is everything. And
Right.
with Him in us, we can accomplish anything that He wants us to accomplish. But then there's also something going on with gratitude, which I haven't quite figured out, but I think the same kind of thing is happening, where gratitude attracts a certain thing and repels a lack of gratitude repels something else. A lack of humility definitely repels gratitude, because if you behave in an arrogant manner, it doesn't matter how much you do for somebody else, they are not going to be thankful for it.
Yeah.
So the world is such an interesting place.
It is.
But I think we have probably extended our listeners' patience long enough. It's been 2 hours.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I'll be interested to hear. Let's listen back to this. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here. For me, very personal things as well. That, like, you know, I feel like this has stuff real bearing in my life at the moment. So
Well, should we publish it, or should I just send it to you and have you listen to it first?
yeah, we could think about it.
Okay, I'll send it to you.
Perfect.
Sounds good. I'm
All
looking
right.
forward to our talk with Luke. We just have to figure out a time.
Yeah. Have you ever talked to him at all on this
Well,
stuff?
we were like two ships passing in the night. I
Yeah.
had to cancel one day, then he had to cancel one day, then
Okay.
so we just never made it happen.
Maybe we could do like later in the week, like Friday or something.
Okay,
All right.
sounds good.
All right.
Goodbye, Michael.
Take care. Bye.
And this is signing off from the Meaning Code. If you like our content, go ahead and click subscribe and come back for the next episode.